Goeiedag! Good day, fellow South Africans. And, you know, from someone who did grow up in the apartheid times and who did see the inequality that was going on, and one of the key reasons I left South Africa in 1986 was because of apartheid. I look back at those times politically, and there was a lady by the name of Helen Suzman who was very, very pro-black government and in fact was one of the key instigators of this happening. And I will attach below her Wikipedia page so you can read this for yourself. Her post-parliamentary career, 1989 to 2009. Suzman was appointed by Mandela to the first Electoral Commission of South Africa that oversaw the first election based on universal franchise in 1994. She was chairwoman of the Vaal Reef Disaster Fund for 3 years, appointed to look after the widows and children of the 104 men killed in the Vaal Reef mining disaster on the 10th of May 1995. She was president of the South African Institute of Race Relations, one of the premier research institutions in South Africa. She served as a member of the Human Rights Commission from 1995 to 1998. She was present with Mandela when he signed the new constitution in 1996. Okay, what does this lady have to say about what is happening or what happened in South Africa? Because, you know, this is when she was 86 in 2004, so... Okay. Speaking in 2004, at the age of 86, Suzman confessed that she was disappointed by the African National Congress. Suzman stated, "I had hoped for something much better. The poor in this country have not benefited at all from the ANC. This government spends like a drunken sailor. Instead of investing in projects to give people jobs, they spend millions buying weapons and private jets and sending gifts to Haiti. Has anything changed, guys? Nope." There's a video that's coming up which will really interest you, and we'll go into that in a bit. But let's get back to Helen Suzman. Referring to South African relations with Zimbabwe, whose president Robert Mugabe had in 2001 declared Suzman an enemy of the state. Don't you love this shit? I mean, you can't make this up. You can't make this shit up. You really. Helen Suzman was an enemy of the state. Anyway, Suzman said in response, "Mugabe has destroyed that country while South Africa has stood by and done nothing. The way Mugabe was feted at the inauguration last month was an embarrassing disgrace, but it served well to illustrate very clearly Mbeki's point of view." How deluded Helen Suzman was. She really thought that the black African people and the black African leaders have the same culture as the white people in South Africa. No, I'm sorry, they don't. And no race has the same culture and the same way of thinking. The Chinese think differently to the white people. The Indians think differently to the white people. And you just have to look at what they do and where they go and how, where they get employed and how they work as a group. And we can cut it even finer. The British think differently to the Portuguese, for example. The Portuguese are an incredibly family-orientated group. You know, everything depends around the family. That is the way they think. My point here is that every group has a different cultural perspective on life. And the thing that's missing for everybody here is that they think that because you're white, you're going to think like the black guy. And you don't. Logic is clearly missing when it comes to the black guy. I don't want to go into this subject any further right now, but that is absolutely a no-brainer. You just have to watch and realize that that is the reality. Now, I am so friggin' far off topic. Let me get back onto what Helen Suzman had to say. Okay, I'll just repeat the last statement she said about Mugabe. Okay, Helen Suzman said, Mugabe has destroyed that country while South Africa has stood by and done nothing. The way Mugabe was feted at the inauguration last month, this is when the ANC took over, was an embarrassing disgrace, but it served well to illustrate very clearly Mbeki's point of view. Suzman also stated her distrust of the racist politics of Mbeki. Now, look, this is history, guys. I know it's history. It's 25 years ago. But remember that today, your current prominent politicians, including one Malema and one Ramaphosa, are blaming the whites for the trouble that's happening with Eskom. Let's just understand how this in the black head is not working properly. Okay, getting back to Helen Suzman, referring to South African relations with Zimbabwe, whose President Robert Mugabe had in 2001 declared Suzman an enemy of the state, she said, Mugabe has destroyed that country. Okay, I've said that before. Suzman also stated her distrust on the racial politics of Mbeki. Don't think for a moment that Mbeki is not anti-white. He is most definitely anti-white. Now, that is a government, because Mbeki was a key political player in the government, which had a clear agenda, which was anti-one race, which is the argument for asylum. And this is way back. This is over 10 years ago. Anyway, let's keep on reading what Suzman says. Suzman says, his speeches all have anti-white themes, and he continues to convince everyone that there are two types of South African, the poor blacks and the rich white. Perhaps conscious that she might be misconstrued, Suzman added, for all my criticism of the current system, it doesn't mean that I would like to return to the old one. I don't think we will ever go the way of Zimbabwe, but people are entitled to be concerned. I'm hopeful about our future for whites in this country, but not entirely optimistic. Now, remember, this was written over 10 years ago. Today, Suzman would have a totally different mantra. And that mantra would be that the whites should never have handed the country back to the black population. There's no question about that. And there's it's not a wonderful, it's a clear example of what I'm talking about here. And it once again involves this really incredible fellow, Ernst Sturz, from AfriForum, in a debate with a woman called Terry Oakley Smith, who is defending the South African Human Rights Commission. And, you know, she just, you know, if I saw her on the street, I'd look the other way. She is just disgusting. She is suggesting that 25 years after the white population gave South Africa to the ANC, that only 1%, get this, only 1% of white people live in poverty, according to the South African Human Rights Commission. Earlier today, I had on my live stream, and I'll put the link directly below, a lady who said quite clearly that there are 200, yeah, you heard me right, 200 squatter camps in Pretoria, which are whites. They are white-only squatter camps, and they average between 50 to 70 people in families. And they're in caravan parks, they're in parks, they're under bridges, they're God knows where else they are. These are people who are suffering because of BEE, Black Equality Employment, which basically prevents whites from getting a job in South Africa. And the reason why things are going so badly pear-shaped, like Eskom, like South African Airways. I used to fly South African Airways. I wouldn't go near it with a barge pole now. You know, anything to do with BEE, I wouldn't go near with a barge pole, because the people who are running these things are incompetent. Look no further than our friend Fakamani of Eskom. He's Fakamani'd the country. And let's face it, that nothing's been done about the corruption. You know, when you listen to this video and you consider the real issues in South Africa right now are incompetence and corruption at all levels in organizations like Eskom, you will realize how deluded this Terry Oakley Smith is. And for my followers who follow this channel, and please, I would love to have a live stream chat with Ernst Rutz. If anybody knows him or can contact him, I have reached out to him a while ago now, but I think we have so much we can discuss. All right, guys, have a great evening and a great day. It's night time here in Australia. I've had a long day, believe me. All right, take care, and please remember to subscribe to be kept informed. Bye for now.
With us. Now, how does white privilege look like in 2018? Does it still exist? Perhaps. One can't help but raise these questions after a recent equality report by the South African Human Rights Commission. Now, the Commission report found that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. 64% of black South Africans and 41% of colored people are living in poverty. That's compared to 6% of the Indian population, and just 1% of whites in the same category. Now with me, I've got Terry Oakley Smith from Diversity and Ernst Rutz from AfriForum to discuss. Thank you so much for joining me on a Saturday morning. I hope that people have filled up on their coffee for this discussion. Now, that report came out about a week ago, and it really got a lot of people talking. Ernst, your thoughts on that report?
Well, I was disappointed by the report for a few reasons. The one was the fact that they repeatedly quoted ANC policy documents, which is of course a political party, in the document. And the other thing is, there's a few things, but I think one of the overarching problems for me was it's called implicit bias. It's when you make an argument without providing the evidence or the data, in the assumption that the data would prove you right. And the data is out, and the data is proving them wrong. And what I'm referring to is what should be done to address inequality, or what can we do? And the assumption is that that which we have been trying to do, which has resulted in a worsening of the problem, must just be done more aggressively. And now somehow doing so there was a half-baked implementation of a proposed solution that resulted in a half-baked failure. Now we need to aggressively implement that, and there's no explanation how that would not lead to an aggressive failure.
Terry?
Well, not surprisingly, perhaps, I disagree with AfriForum. I mean, I think, first of all, it's important to separate white privilege from the results of the Human Rights Commission report.
Indeed, now we're going to get there, but I wanted to get your thoughts on this report specifically
Yes,
first.
well, I mean, I think the report is a shocking indictment on where we are in South Africa 24 years after democracy. I, as a white person, feel profoundly ashamed that only 1% of South Africans live in poverty, whereas more than 60% of black Africans live in poverty. I think if you also look at NEET, those people who are in education, employment or in training, the numbers are even worse. The vast majority of young black South Africans are unemployed. And even today, Marcel, it's easier for a white person to get a job, for a white person to be assumed to be competent, than for an African, a coloured, and to some extent for an Indian. So I think our country is in a really bad position regarding inequality, political parties notwithstanding.
Now, and I hear what you're trying to say. You're saying that, and I think you were trying very hard not to use the term radical economic transformation, because you're saying that because certain programs from the ANC government has not worked, now they want to do more of what they have failed to actually do. But if we could just look at that specific, the numbers that were given to us, and even just looking at South African society, you have to admit that the vast majority of South Africa that is living in poverty is black, and the least amount of people living in poverty is white.
Yes, certainly.
And that speaks to white privilege, does it not?
No, it doesn't. How does it speak to white privilege? Well, I can tell you why it's not speaking to white privilege. There are a variety of reasons, and I think part of the problem is this idea of cultural relativism, which implies that if different people do things in different ways, the result will always be the same. And if the result is not the same, it's because the one has necessarily oppressed the other. It's not necessarily true in post-apartheid South Africa. So, for example, the fact that 1 in 3 black children, black babies who are born in South Africa, are born into families with without both of their parents, which has a significant impact on their chances of succeeding. The fact that 80% of schools in this country are dysfunctional, and it's mostly the schools in black areas. The fact that it has been found the reason why black schools are failing is not because white people are oppressing them, it's because black teachers are not showing up to teach. The fact that there's a big variety of problems in South Africa, but those aren't looked at because the problem and the reason why they aren't looked at is because these white privilege activists, it appears, I want to say the majority of them, but at least those who are most vocal, are driven more by their envy or perhaps even their hatred for the haves than their compassion for the have-nots. So when they see lines of inequality and they see white people have a lower level of unemployment, they are more angry about the fact that white people have more jobs than they are angry about the fact that black people have less jobs. And the question is, how do we solve that? The question, that should be solved by fixing these things that I've mentioned. Instead of that, the proposed solution is we must have redistribution. That's not going to solve the problem.
But Ents, what it sounds like is that you're saying that we just magically got to this place where we're sitting with these issues of inequality. You have to admit we have many generations of people living in poverty right now. Is that because we have generations whose lives were impacted by the fact that there was a system put in place so that a privileged race class could rise and rise and rise. And we're talking about apartheid there. And the genius of apartheid was the fact that they knew that it would reach its sell-by date. And once it did reach its sell-by date, that the generations of that white privileged class that followed would continue to reap the benefits of better education, of being to live wherever they wanted to, having better loans, being able to do whatever they wanted, and the vast majority of the country not being able to. You cannot say that generations of white South Africans that have come after apartheid came to an end, did not benefit from the many benefits that their parents, their grandparents and their great-grandparents had from that system that was put in place.
Well, everywhere I've been in my life, I've been outperformed by black people, in primary school, in high school, at university.
Because they were finally given a fair chance and a fair opportunity.
Yes,
like
and they received proper education, which is something that the majority of black people in this country are not receiving. And it's not white people who are oppressing them. It's not white people who are the cause of the fact that black people, black children do not get textbooks. But there where it happens, there where the Department of Education actually do their job, or where they go to private schools or private universities or whatever, there it works. And yes, we can talk about apartheid, and we've been very vocal about our criticism on apartheid. And we should be, and we should continue to do so. But the assumption is somehow that if there wouldn't have been apartheid, again, this comes back to cultural relativism. If there wouldn't have been apartheid, that's the only explanation for black people living in poverty. As if apartheid never existed, black people would have all been rich and white, and there would have been perfect equality. There's no evidence that that would have been the case. Why am I saying this? Because there are many countries, or there are countries in the world that have never been colonized, that have never been oppressed by anyone, and those countries are the poorest countries in the world, poorer than black people in South Africa are today. So we must be it again comes back to the implicit bias. We can and we should attack and criticize apartheid, but we shouldn't have this implicit bias where we just assume certain things without having any evidence for this.
Terry?
So I think this is a very good example of mansplaining and whitesplaining that's going on here. I'm grateful that you're giving me an opportunity to say something. I think there's complete confusion between white privilege and inequality.
Indeed.
Inequality is the result of apartheid. And it's not that apartheid has in some magical way stopped to function in the same way. Black people are still as underprivileged as they were during those years. You've only got to travel into a rural area to see that.
They are less.
And it's not possible for the government we have, with the policies it has going on, to change that. And I think that it goes far beyond cultural relativism. White privilege is very simple. It's a set of unearned privileges that come to you simply because you're white.
Like what?
If I go to school, for example, if my children or grandchildren go to school, they're very likely to see characters in books that look like them. That doesn't happen for black children.
And would you give us a chance, please?
It is not blatantly false.
I went to school much more recently than you did. I looked. There were pictures of black children in the
They are few and far between. This is something that's currently being researched. It's something that's completely unearned, and Ernst makes the mistake, as many white defensive people do, of assuming it has to do with wealth. It doesn't. It has to do with those privileges we have that are unearned. I can tell you, Marcel, that if Ernst and a black person went in for an interview for a job, there would be an assumption, just looking at Ernst, that he is competent. He doesn't have to prove it. It's part of who he is.
That
comes with his whiteness.
Because it's more probable that a white
and the black
person would be more
person that comes with him.
And would you give her a chance to speak? We had a long conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, but I find it a bit offensive that I'm accused of mansplaining and
Can I just finish my sentence,
Isn't it a little bit racist?
Marcel, can I just
go ahead,
my
Terry.
sentence?
Yeah.
That, and the black person coming in has to work really hard, and more especially if she's a woman, to prove that competence. And that is what white privilege is about. It's what we haven't earned, but that somehow or other is part of who we are.
Now, the thing that shocked me the most of this report and various other reports, I remember listening to an interview that you did in radio last year, and it was about the South African Labour Force report that had come out that really showed that white men were still given preference in the workplace. And there are numbers to actually show that. Anecdotally, you just have to look at the Sunday papers when they announce who the new executives or promotions are.
I will tell you the numbers, Ernst. The latest Employment Equity Commission report, which came out a couple of weeks ago, shows that the top 3 levels of employment, top management, senior management and middle management, are still grossly overrepresented by white people and white men in particular. That's one of the things. Okay. That white men have more money spent on them for training, which I find absolutely extraordinary, than do people of other racial groups, and also for recruitment and advancement. So one can blame the Department of Labour and say they haven't done nearly enough to monitor employment equity. But the actual statistics that come out show very clearly that we are still in a very privileged position as white people, and especially as white men.
Ernst, would you disagree with that?
Yes, I do. Well, firstly, the point I was trying to make, that it is more probable that a white person would be more competent for a particular job because white people generally have better access to education. And I know you're smirking because you're thinking I'm trying to make a very racist
Go
statement.
ahead, explain
I'm
yourself.
not. The point that I've made earlier, that the majority of black people, black children in this country, go to schools where firstly they don't understand the language that is being taught to them when they go to grade 1. Secondly, it's schools that are not properly managed. I'm just quoting Stats South Africa. So that's firstly. Secondly, yes, it's true that on top management level there are more white people than black people.
And senior management,
yes,
and
senior
middle management.
yes, which is, I think, less than 1% of the population of South Africa, so we need to look at the bigger picture. But what you are not proving is, why is this not the result of other things? Why is it exclusively the result of oppression? So a board sat together, for example, the board of whichever company, said, okay, we all agree we don't like black people, so how are we going to push the black people out, and how are we going to appoint white people?
No, it's not like that, Arndt. That's
so
simplifying
explain to me the oppression.
I will explain to you. When that person goes in for an interview, guess what the board looks like? The board are usually white and usually male. Only one woman sits on a board of a top 40 country in South Africa. So they mainly look like you and me. We feel more comfortable with people like you and me. It's more likely that we're going to decide to put somebody who we feel comfortable with in those positions. So it's not direct oppression, as you're suggesting, but it is because we feel more comfortable. And until we change those top levels, starting with boards and moving through top senior and middle management, we're not going to be able to develop all of the people in our country in an equal way that they should be developed.
And would you admit that there is a need for change and that it needs to happen faster than it currently is?
That's the point that I'm trying to make.
Because it's happening at a fast pace.
Yes.
But don't you believe we then have to first admit what the issues are before they can be addressed, and in a more aggressive way?
I'm admitting the problem, and I've been admitting it since the beginning of this interview. Every time I've spoken, the only thing that I've said. But
you first have to admit that this is the issue. The first step is admitting that there is a problem, and you're saying that white privilege is not an issue.
No, it's not, because it's not. It's the fact that 9 out of 10 black babies in this country are born in a house with both of their parents, as opposed to 1 in 3 black babies. Don't blame white people for that. The fact that black schools are dysfunctional because black teachers don't show up to teach.
So
don't blame white people
all
for that.
agree that the 20 years that we've had in democracy, the government has not done enough of what it's needed to do to redress those issues.
I would frame it differently.
But the issues, the vast majority of the issues that they've had to deal with over the plus 20 years has been as a result of oppression. And even though it doesn't have a name anymore and it's not in law, it doesn't mean that there aren't racial practices out there in terms of how we do business, how people are treated, and how fortunes are handed out.
Well, I would disagree. I would frame it differently. It's not that government hasn't done enough. Government has done too much. They've done too much in the wrong direction. That's the problem.
Okay.
The way, how are we going to address these issues? Firstly, it's very interesting. There was a recent study which said that, looking at history, it's as if mankind or humankind still hasn't really figured out how to address inequality. Even the most communist, socialist countries have not been able to solve the problem of inequality. I think what we can solve is poverty. And how do we solve that? How do we fix that? We fix that firstly by fixing the education system. Secondly, by empowering people, by making it possible for people, or easier for people, to start their own companies, to employ people. Those are the things that we should be doing. But what government has been doing to now has been counterproductive. So there's such an aggressive regulation of the labor market that it's becoming harder and harder to start businesses. It's becoming more difficult to employ people. And those things are worsening the problem. So where government has intervened, it has worsened the problem instead of the other way around.
No, I mean, I think that, you know, government has tried in many ways, and in some ways have failed. And I'm not here to speak on behalf of the ANC. I'm actually in favour of far more radical economic transformation than is the ANC. But I think if you look at the kind of laws that have been put in place, like employment equity, like BBBEE, they have been put in place to try and provide a more equal playing field. The fact that many companies are very cynical about their implementation, the fact that many companies don't implement them at all or implement them maliciously, is not the fault of the laws themselves, but the people that actually implement them. There's just something about South Africa that somehow we're not moving forward. The news clip that we saw before we began about people still feeling okay to use the K word when they know that the kind of pain that that can cause. The fact that only 18% of South Africans have any real friends of other races. I mean, how are we going to develop a country and develop equality in a country without making sterling efforts to educate each other about each other, to actually put aside our biases, as you say, and actually reach out to each other? It's not enough to just say 1 in 10 black children are born to single parents. I mean, many children are born to single parents who succeed very well. Yes. I don't think that can possibly be a reason why we have such gross inequality in South Africa. And I think it has to go back to the fact that we haven't done enough of what we should have been doing since apartheid. And that would be my contention.
Unfortunately, we need to leave that conversation there. I'm sure people will find you on those Twitter streets to continue the conversation. Terry Oakley-Smith from Diversity Change Management Consultancy and Ernst Witz from AfriForum. Thank you so much for your time.